So now we're going to demonstrate the process of inoculation. First, I do want to touch base briefly on log selection. What we have here is a sugar maple log that is in some ways not an ideal candidate because I cut it out of a tree that still had some green leaves on it. It hasn't fully gone dormant yet, but for the purpose of this demonstration, the timing, it was a suitable species. Sugar maple is my favorite wood to grow shiitake on after oak. This tree also has a little bit of dark spots on the end, which is less than ideal, but this is what we've got to work with, and chances are it'll still grow shiitake just fine. This is in the 4 to 8 inch diameter ideal range for the size of the log. It's a little shorter than I normally cut them. 3 to 4 foot is a typical length log that you're aiming for. But the important thing with shiitake is that you want to pick oak or sugar maple ideally, although there are other species that are suitable, and I've had pretty good luck with paper birch in recent years I've experimented with because it became available through a local tree trimmer. And it has produced very well. I've had decent luck on gum, black gum specifically, and I've had decent luck on hickory. And there are other species that will grow shiitake, but sugar maple and oak should always be your first choice if you have that option. 4 to 8 inches diameter is the size recommendation because smaller logs dry out more completely during a dry spell, which is not a good thing. Bigger logs can be unwieldy and hard to handle. If you've got a 3 or 4 foot log, once you get over 10 inches in diameter, that can be a little bit heavy to handle. You want to cut your trees when they're dormant and ideally get them inoculated within a month. There's been some research in northern climates that longer aging of the wood before you plant it is better and actually produces better shiitake. But where we are in a warmer climate, more moderate climate, I think a month is generally the longest you want to wait after you've cut the tree before you inoculate the logs. In the interim, you want to store the logs where they don't get too dried out. I like to keep them in longer lengths. Sometimes I'll leave the whole tree whole until right before I'm going to inoculate. Then I cut it into the 3 or 4 foot lengths. And you want to keep it out of the sun. You don't want your logs sitting around in the direct sunlight while they're waiting to be inoculated. With mushroom cultivation in general, it's all about conserving moisture because if the wood gets too dried out, it can not just reduce the production of mushrooms, it can kill the mycelium so it'll never produce any mushrooms. Moisture is key. So where you're going to keep your logs after you inoculate them is extremely important. You want the less sun and the less wind, the more mushrooms you're going to pick and the more likely you will succeed in getting the mushrooms to grow to start with. So we're going to take this sugar maple log and I'm going to start by demonstrating the traditional drill and wax method. I've used a number of different drills over the years, but I have settled on this angle grinder. It works extremely well and is the most efficient tool I have used thus far. The tool itself was not a big expense, but this angle grinder adapter that allows us to mount this specific drill bit designed for shiitake cultivation onto the angle grinder actually costs a little bit more than the angle grinder. These come in both aluminum and steel. The aluminum wore out pretty quickly. The steel one is worth the extra 10 bucks. I'll tell you that right now. These drill bits aren't cheap at $12 a piece, but they're extremely well suited to the process. The diameter of it is perfectly matched to the inoculation tool that we're going to use to introduce the spawn into the log. So the diameter of this cavity is matched to the size of this drill bit. It's got a brad tip on it, so it pulls it into the log. You don't have to lean on the drill at all. And it's got a stop collar so that you get exactly the depth that you want that also matches the depth of the cavity in this inoculation tool. When you're drilling the log with something like an angle grinder, I find it easier to leave the drill on and just zip, zip, zip right through it. Turn the log, zip, zip, zip. It goes faster that way as opposed to turning it on and off for each hole. The spacing of the holes is kind of important. You want to keep the holes roughly 6 inches apart in rows that are roughly 2 inches apart, as I'm about to demonstrate. You want to stay away from the last 2 or 3 inches of the log because that part of the log dries out first, and there's not much point in putting spawn in it, as the spawn is less likely to do well there. As long as you get the rest of the log inoculated fully, those ends don't need drilled holes in them. So I'm going to stay about 3 inches away from the ends of the log. So this is the drill pattern. I'll demonstrate for you. One thing I forgot to mention that is you want to cut the wood you're inoculating out of live, healthy trees. Otherwise, they've already got fungus in them that you're going to be competing with. You don't want that. Live, healthy trees are least likely to have some other fungi in them already. All right. So now into each one of these drilled holes, as quickly as possible so the inside of there doesn't get dried out, we're going to introduce the spawn. And this is a bag of shiitake spawn. You can tell by all the whiteness that the mycelium has fully colonized this bag of sterilized sawdust. And this bag of spawn costs me $20. It's a typical cost for about a 5-pound bag of spawn, so it's not a lot because this is enough spawn to inoculate anywhere from 20 to 40 logs, depending on the size of the log and the technique you're using. So this comes sealed. As soon as I pop the seal on this, there's potential contamination there, so you need to use it up within ideally like a month or so. You've got some leeway, but the sooner you use it up, the better. While it's still sealed, you can store this stuff in the fridge for 6 months or a year without a problem. But once you break that seal, you need to use it up pretty quickly. Also, this is one type of spawn that you can get. This is sawdust spawn, but you can get spawn in other forms. This is the most practical I've found for a variety of reasons. It lends itself to several different inoculation techniques. It's also the cheapest investment per log form of spawn. But the drawback to sawdust spawn is more vulnerable to drying out. So whenever you're not getting spawn out of the bag, you want to keep the bag closed up and keep it as sealed as possible. So now I'm going to fill each of these holes with this specifically designed inoculation tool. It's spring-loaded. So I'm going to jam it down in here a couple times to make sure I fully fill up the void here, and then just place it over the hole and give it one good firm pop. And oftentimes I'll push down in the hole to make sure it gets fully filled, and that one did not, so I'm actually going to redo that hole. Yeah, I need to jam it down in here a couple more times, it looks like. All right, now the hole is full, which I can tell because I can push down there and there's resistance. To get this cavity full, I usually end up poking it down into the bag of spawn at least 3 times to get it full. Yeah, that one I got it full that time with the first round of jabbing it into the spawn. You want to get each hole full of spawn. You don't want air spaces. Once you seal it up, ideally that hole should be completely full of spawn without much, if any, air. It's helpful to have a device that'll hold your logs at a comfortable working height. I just built these from some scrap wood I had. This same technique can be used for a variety of different wood decaying fungi like lion's mane, reishi, and other species. Some of those mushrooms aren't quite as aggressive at colonizing the wood, and they recommend a higher rate of inoculation. So you might actually space these holes twice as close together, and the rows may be up to twice as close together to maximize your potential for success. Because those mushrooms do not colonize the wood as readily as something like shiitake or oyster. All right, that log is fully inoculated, so I'm going to close up this bag of spawn. And we're going to wax these holes shut. Let me grab my melted wax. Is a mixture of mineral oil and any kind of wax or paraffin I can lay my hands on. In this case, it's an old candle that I melted down. And I've got a dauber that's kind of ideally suited to this. I think this is commonly used in leather craft for painting leather and that sort of thing, or gluing it. So it's just like basically a cotton ball. It's not cotton, it's a synthetic fiber on the end of a wire. It lends itself to dipping in here and gathering enough wax to seal these holes. You want to use as little wax as you can get away with, because you're just trying to seal the hole is all you're doing. Ideally, you don't have much wax on the log outside of the hole. The wax cools pretty quickly to the point where I can rotate the log without all the wax running out, as you can see. Once the wax starts to cool off and set up, it can be a little harder and less efficient to seal the holes, but the advantage to mixing your wax with mineral oil is that you can actually still apply it and just smear it on if need be, even after the wax cools off. And once it does cool off, it's not nearly as brittle and prone to being accidentally knocked off when you're handling the log, taking it to the place where it's going to live. Ideally, if your wax is molten enough, you can just let it drip in and fill up the holes, kind of like this, which is a little more efficient. If you have to touch the thing to it, you end up getting more wax on it and using more wax to seal each hole. But usually just 2 or 3 drips per hole is enough to seal it. And maybe just a brief, just barely touch it like that. That's kind of the technique that I end up using. Sometimes you can get enough wax to seal multiple holes per dip. And that log is done. The only thing left to do is to tag it. I like to tag my log so that I know which variety of shiitake I planted and when I planted it. Usually I just put the year and the variety. In this case, this is kind of a generic variety of shiitake. I'm not even sure if it's a cold weather strain or a warm weather strain. So I've just put SH for shiitake and the date October of 2020. And these are just commonly available garden tags. I cut them in half so I can get twice as many out of a bag of tags because they're not cheap. But they're very handy. And I've just got a little roofing nail there. And that log is done. All I have to do now is put it in a shady spot where it won't get dried out by sun or wind, ideally, and wait. And it could start producing within a year, but sometimes it can take 2 or 3 years for the logs to get started. Oftentimes, if I'm inoculating in the spring, I won't see any mushrooms until fall, a year and a half later. Occasionally, 1 or 2 of the logs will form a shiitake or 2 the fall after I inoculate, just like 6 months later. But more typically, it's a year and a half, and it can be 2 or 3 years, depending on the size of the log and how vigorous the strain you're planting in is. Some strains of shiitake take longer to colonize the log. I guess now I can demonstrate the chainsaw method that I developed. So early on in my cultivation experience, I noticed that the oyster mushrooms were more vigorous and more quick to colonize the wood and start producing. And I suspected that there was probably a shortcut to drilling 30 or 40 holes per log and having to wax each hole individually. And I did a little research and a little experimentation, and I came up with this method that I will now demonstrate for you. This is an electric chainsaw that I like for this process because it's light, it's less, it doesn't throw the chips as far, make as much noise, so I don't feel as much need to have all the protective gear I use with my normal chainsaw work. So I'm just making a groove, maybe 3/4 of an inch deep, maybe 1/2 an inch wide, just big enough basically to allow room for some spawn to get in there. And I'm placing these notches strategically I put these two on opposite sides of the log from each other so I can cover them both with one wrap of duct tape. Similarly, these two. And because the spawn, as it's colonizing the log, grows much faster along the grain than it does across the grain, this notch should colonize this entire side of the log. The one on the opposite side should get the opposite side of the log. These two notches should get the rest of the log. And I only use maybe a tablespoon of spawn per notch. You can probably get away with less than that. And I'm just basically getting the spawn in contact with the sapwood that I have exposed with the notch. And then what I like to do to create a little nursery bed for it to grow in while it's getting established is take some of the fresh sawdust that I made while I was cutting the logs to length and finish filling up that void. I want the notch completely full of spawn and fresh sawdust of the same species of wood that I'm planting the mushrooms on, because again, this is like a little nursery bed. It can colonize this sawdust more easily and more quickly than it can the solid wood of the log. And the sawdust is fresh and moist, so even when I turn it upside down to do the other side, it doesn't all fall out. A little bit does, but plenty is still in there, you'll see. And that way I can get both notches filled with spawn before I try and seal it with duct tape. Now, one of the implications to using duct tape in this method is microplastics, which I've come to understand better in recent years. So I'm less excited about introducing more duct tape and microplastics into the world, but there are other options. You could wax this hole shut, actually. That's a little bit less efficient time-wise, but that's just one method. You could take basically anything that would hold the spawn in there and protect it from drying out and being consumed by bugs, because slugs and beetles love spawn and mushrooms, and you're trying to keep them out while that spawn gets established in the log. We're having a rainy spell right now, so this log is fairly moist, so the duct tape isn't sticking terribly well to the log itself, which is why I like to wrap it all the way around so it can at least adhere to itself. And that's good enough to do the job. That will hold moisture in and keep the bugs out. And so this log is half inoculated already once I get these two notches filled. Little fresh sawdust to top it off. I make these notches in kind of a V shape so that they're wide enough that I can get my fingers in there to pack the hole full, or the notch, fill it back up. So my initial experimentation and research showed that the drilling method, I can spend about 20 minutes per log. Once I get everything set up and all my materials on hand, it takes me about 20 minutes by myself to do the drill and wax method, and this takes me about 5 minutes. And less spawn. I can stretch out my spawn and get roughly twice as many logs out of a bag of spawn. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the logs tend to not be as productive with this method because the rate of inoculation, the number of inoculation sites per log, is substantially less. And generally speaking, the higher the rate of inoculation, the more mushrooms you're going to pick. But this shortcut method does work. It's just not quite as guaranteed for maximum production as the drilling and waxing method. But with oyster mushrooms, I have found this technique to be plenty adequate. I've had pretty good luck with shiitake. but in recent years I have noticed that the shiitake logs produce better when they're drilled, noticeably. And then the stump technique, I could demonstrate on this log actually. So I'd like to also show you how I inoculate a stump, because it's a little different. Unfortunately, we don't have a stump readily available to demonstrate with today, so I'd like you to pretend that this is the stump of a tree. This is the log I just inoculated with the chainsaw duct tape method. But if this were the top of a stump out in the woods, what I would do is take my cordless drill, and in this case, I'm using my angle grinder, but I can use a cordless drill out in the woods wherever I want to go. And I'm going to drill a hole into the sapwood, not into the heartwood, but into the sapwood about every 2 inches around the circumference of this stump top. Wow. Wow, there's some hard knots in there that are resistant. This bit might be getting a little bit dull. They do not last forever, but you can get hundreds of logs from one bit typically. So these holes are in the face, the cut face of the stump. So you're not going through the bark like you would with a log. And then you just fill them just like you would if they were the log. Same method. And we will seal them with wax in the same way. Having molten wax up in the woods can be a little bit challenging, and again demonstrates the advantage of having mineral oil or some kind of oil, you can use others, mixed in with your wax, because even after your wax is cooled off, like for instance this wax has, it's already set up, but I can still kind of smear some wax on there because it's still pliable enough to work with and get the holes sealed. And that's the main reason that I like to mix mineral oil with my wax, is it allows me to not have to always have fully molten wax. That's inevitably when I've got some friends over and we're doing a production line, it's the molten wax that ends up being the bottleneck, inevitably. So mix an oil with your wax, and I think you can actually now buy plug wax that has it pre-mixed, but this is of course a cheaper alternative. And that's it. There's another method I've used very successfully with stump cultivation, which is just cutting off the top of the stump, packing that cut surface with spawn, putting the piece I just cut off back on top of it, and taking a plastic grocery bag and putting it over top of it and kind of tying it in place with some baling twine or something and leaving that bag on it for about 4 months. And then you can take the plastic bag off and it feels like the top is glued on because the mycelium has grown into both sides and it's kind of holding it together. You can break it off easily, but it's kind of stuck. And that is just as effective a method as this and doesn't require the drill or the wax. Yeah, I've had very good luck with that technique as well. And again, with shiitake, sugar maple, and oak stumps, I've had great production out of. And with the oyster mushrooms, tulip poplar stumps have been very good, reliable producers. And I've had decent luck with other species as well, like elm yeah, elm and tulip poplar seem to be our best woods around here. Maple will grow oysters pretty well too. I find the wild oyster mushrooms that grow here most commonly on tulip poplar, but I find them on everything from hackberry to elm to basswood, yeah, box elder, and they will grow on hickory, even though that's a denser hardwood tree. Oyster mushrooms love hickory, and I have had decent luck growing shiitake on hickory as well. I've heard others say that certain kinds of hickory at least haven't worked well for them, but the hickory I have planted shiitake on grows pretty well. And I've even had decent luck with oysters growing on hickory stumps. I don't usually plant oysters on hickory logs, but I have done a little bit of that, and those have actually produced reasonably well as well. Other technique that we talked about briefly earlier is the totem technique, which when you have larger diameter logs, too big to be able to handle in 3 or 4 foot sections, can be a really good way to plant oyster or shiitake mushrooms on. And in recent years, I've come to understand that the hericium species, like lion's mane and bear's head tooth, grow even better on the totems than they do on logs that I have drilled and waxed with this method. Even logs that I have drilled in a much more concentrated pattern, say twice as many holes per log as I just demonstrated with the shiitake, have not produced as well as the totem method with the hericium mushrooms I have planted. So let's go out here and look again at the totems that I was showing you. So these are relatively small diameter pieces of wood. It's not the best example, but this is a bigger chunk. And these, obviously in this kind of diameter, a 3 or 4 foot log would be a little unwieldy. But you can take shorter sections of wood like this, put them inside of a plastic bag with spawn in the bottom of the bag under the wood, a layer of spawn in between each of the cut pieces, and cap it off with a small section of wood, or you can just put spawn on the top and cover it with newspaper or cardboard or something, and then enclose the whole thing in a plastic bag loosely so that it can still breathe. You don't want it airtight. And set it out of the sun, because you don't want the sun cooking it in that bag. It can kill it. It needs to be in a shady spot. And once you leave it there for, say, 6 months, then you can take it out of the bag, set it in an area where it'll get rained on. And it's a pretty reliable way to grow not only hericium mushrooms on sugar maple, but I've had very good luck growing golden oyster mushrooms on sycamore, maple, tulip poplar, and a variety of other softer hardwood species. And I've been experimenting in recent years with growing shiitake on oak logs with a similar method, and it seems to work reasonably well for the shiitake as well, the totem. You're only limited in terms of the size of the wood you have by what you can fit inside the plastic bag. Yeah, that's a nice thing about the totem method. You can be working with wood this big in diameter. You can just cut it into like an 8-inch section or something. And as long as it'll fit inside that plastic bag, you just layer the spawn on each cut surface of the chunks of wood you've got, and close it all up, set it aside. Here's a couple of totem methods that I planted this spring that we just opened the bags on recently. This is paper birch that I planted shiitake on. You can see the white mycelial growth growing on the top of that one on the left there, showing that the shiitake has in fact colonized it. And we're just getting ready to set these out in the rain here where they can do their thing. And chances are next spring they'll be producing, and we might even pick some of them off, some shiitake off of these totems this fall. I hope you've enjoyed the summit, and feel free to reach out and contact me with questions. At my website, you'll find our email address. And good luck growing mushrooms.